Hello and welcome to this episode looking behind the curation of the Mercer Gallery's Total Recall Myth and Memory exhibition. Today I'm joined by Chris Wood, who's one of the artists who has work in the Mercer Gallery archive that is sitting alongside these 5 guest artists that we've got in the show. Christopher's work explores mystical themes, history, the outdoors, quite surreal at times, symbolism. There's a lot of different elements to unpack in Chris's work, and it's wonderful to be joined by the artists so we can have a longer conversation about how these works came to be, what developments have happened in Chris's practice since those works were made, and all sorts of different things behind the work itself. Thank you so much for joining with me today.
You're welcome.
So we've already had a bit of a chat off camera about where you started from, starting in London, doing a postgrad, and then eventually coming up to Yorkshire, and that you kind of see your work as not necessarily being just landscape paintings, but this depiction of a world not inside, something outside, something beyond ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think it would just be really nice to explore those ideas. You know, are the landscapes that you put in your work, are they real or are they imagined? That's something that I've been really wanting to find out.
Right. Well, it's an interesting question because in some respects it's impossible to not create a landscape which is kind of real in some respects, because everything we see and everything I paint is a reflection of something that I've seen. So the Yorkshire landscape, particularly kind of Lower Wharfdale, is a kind of reoccurs in a mythic way in my imagination, and that's the landscape that quite often appears in nearly all of the work that I do. So in some respects, it's a landscape which is been absorbed over the course of a lifetime, and it exists in my imagination in kind of mythic proportions. And for me, painting is an imaginative act, and so naturally the space that appears when I'm painting is a landscape, and often that landscape reflects my environment, which is principally the Dales and Lower Wharfdale, and occasionally the Pennines.
But I like that idea that a landscape from your past could sort of seep in and it becomes this composite world. And the exhibition that we've done at the Mercer, it's all about blurring the lines between what is truth, what is reality, what is the world around us, and how we each have an individual perspective of the world in front of us.
Yeah.
But actually that is going to be different for everybody. And so I think that's something that I've really found inspiring in your practice.
Yeah, well, I think those 3 paintings that you have in the collection at the Mercer Gallery are kind of imbued with a sense of history, because partly the language of them refers not only to the historical language of landscape painting, but those things which are in a sense mark the history of the landscape. So the painting The Erratics is a comment about those erratic glacial boulders, which are quite alien but have been kind of left strewn across the landscape. They're bits of rock which come sometimes from Scandinavia, which dumped in the middle of Yorkshire. So there's a sense of timelessness or history or time already imbued in that landscape, which gives you a kind of strong sense of the mysteriousness of your own presence in the present somehow.
Yes, yeah.
Places you in time.
Well, as we were talking again earlier, is exploring that idea of what is real, does it mean to be human? How can we possibly exist?
Yeah.
All of those big questions, because there's a lot of the unknown in how we've come to be.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
so I suppose, how did those rocks come to be there? How did those moments come to appear in your works?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's been another question that we've been kind of talking about when we've been curating your works, is how long does it take for you to create these textures in the space? Because they seem to be built up over many different layers. But at the same time, I can imagine that it's so difficult to recreate all these different colours that it must happen in a sort of flurry of intense connection with the canvas.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's essentially. I mean, I used to. There was a period when I worked in a kind of quite laborious layering sort of technique. But for a long time now, I've worked in a much more spontaneous wet into wet technique, and alla prima technique, as it's known in painting terms, where you really have about 48 hours to complete the painting while the paint is still wet. So you're creating something in which the whole of the oil surface is integrated, and you can't really then go on and apply a second or third layer. So that it's a bit of a high wire act, but it does create a picture with tremendous spontaneity and vitality, which is a kind of imbued and holds the moment it was painted in, like no other technique. I mean, when it doesn't work, you throw the canvas away and you start again. But for me, the excitement of that process and the way that the paint can reveal things to you as you're working is incredibly exciting. So that's been my, it has limitations for sure, but all painting technique has its own limitations. But yeah, the paintings are the images are kind of sculptured from imagination and paint, from memory, from things which happen immediately in front of the painting. So there is a sense of a unique moment being held there in front of you.
Yeah, and what I like a lot about wet on wet is the drying, when you have those different pigments collide and then they create a different texture as they develop with each other that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were layering dry on dry.
That's absolutely right. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, it just so holds that moment. It is almost like looking over Beethoven's shoulder when he was writing the last part of the manuscript of the Moonlight Sonata or something. You're held in that moment, and of course, this is a unique thing about painting, that it physically holds that moment, and you doesn't need translating in any way. I mean, Beethoven needs playing, but with painting, that moment is held there magically. Rembrandt's marks are held there, Rubens' marks are held there, and in that respect, painting is entirely unique. And if the artist is unique, then you have a strong sense of the person who painted it. There, held in front of you. It's an amazing thing, and often not really considered in the act of looking at a painting.
Well, I think it's quite interesting with the works that we've got on display at the minute, because they were done early 2000s, and your work has changed quite a lot since then.
Yeah.
And you've now got figures involved. Yeah. You've got a lot of different objects within the landscape that aren't necessarily real as we would understand them to be. They're sort of amalgamations of feelings or spirits or different qualities. So how did that process happen over the last sort of 10, 15 years of changing your style? What permitted you to bring these figures from the landscape and place them in there?
Well, I think initially when I started being more interested in the landscape, I felt that if I wanted the painting to be a kind of mysterious image in itself, it would be best served by having no figures in the picture. Because I think what I felt, and I was possibly wrong, is that if you put a figure in a landscape or a couple of figures in a landscape, people immediately want to create a narrative of some kind. They're there for this reason. And I just wanted, in a very existential way, the painting to exist as a place you could travel to or you had come from. So it placed the viewer in a more active kind of situation with respect to to the picture. But then I sort of what happened really was a sort of development of ideas in which I sort of thought that in a way I was depicting landscapes and places which were mysterious. It was a kind of illustration of mystery. And what I actually really wanted to do, and this came from the process of not painting and making collages and making prints, was the realization that I wanted to make something which was just mysterious in itself.
Yeah.
And so suddenly I created a series of paintings in which there was a really recognizable figurative landscape, and then I would stick something in that landscape which was, say, a man turning into a bear, or a strange plant, or a fire that just, that suddenly people would be drawn into this familiar landscape, but then suddenly faced with the great questions: why is that there? Why am I here? And so the paintings, rather than depicting mystery, became mysterious objects in themselves.
Yes, I really enjoy that. I've been reading a lot of Freud at the minute and thinking a lot about binding and how we as people often want to be sort of smooth and secure and familiar, and how unnerving it is to be confronted with things that are unexplainable, mysterious, even though that's what we are. We are this mysterious being.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are all of these mysterious elements.
Yeah.
So I quite like that you're creating this mirror almost to that part of us that we sort of almost try and deny, where it's uncertain, flux, fluid, liminal, like all these words that you've used to describe your work previously. I really enjoy that process.
Yeah, it's an abrupt sort of disjuncture with respect to the sort of familiarity of the landscape, and then something which is oddly mysterious in there. But then that is very true of the way we are in the world if one is vigilant. And it's often people have seen my paintings and they write to me and say, "You'll never guess what I saw in the landscape. There's this really weird thing, and I thought I saw something. And it reminded me of one of those ghosts that you painted." So in a sense, I can't really paint anything which isn't already known, in a sense.
Yeah. But then I suppose that comes back as well to that early philosophy of, well, you can't think of something that hasn't already been thought. You can't imagine something that you haven't already experienced.
Yeah.
And so I suppose everything that's in your work is real in some way, because otherwise you couldn't have made it up.
Yeah, I try and make it as real as possible. And I think that's why so many people respond to it, because even though they may be confronted by something which seems quite alien, that feeling of alienness is familiar.
Yeah.
But not often articulated. I mean, one of the anecdotes which I use to try and explain in a sort of the way how I am in the world as an artist is that if I'm walking, through Gledder Valley Woods, which is just down the road here, and out of the corner of my eye I see a serpent, which on closer inspection turns out to be a tree root, I would paint the serpent, because I'm interested in my original mythic, imaginative response to the world around me. It's far more instinctive, and it connects with the reality of my inner life.
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's very sort of magical realist.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Which I think is one of the real developments of British painting over the last sort of like 20, 30 years has been this sort of the rise of magical realism. And magical realism is where you imbue familiar situations with something extraordinary, or maybe you're painting multiple scenes at once on top, so that you've got this kind of connection between personal and imaginary.
That's right.
And it was, it's been popularized a lot by people like Peter Doig and things like that, but it's not often you see it in terms of just space.
Yeah.
It's often relating to like a figure in a location, and so it's quite refreshing actually to see it in the way that you're doing it, with colours and textures, and yeah, almost like an abstracted version of it, an even further abstracted version of magical realism.
Yeah, and I think I'm doing it in a very unapologetic way. I'm not being reserved about it. I'm saying I'm making that clear. And I think perhaps somebody like Peter Doig, that's less so. It's more reserved and more aesthetic in a way. Whereas I think I'm more abrupt in it by making the situation as real as possible, and then putting something in it which is, in some way contrasts or challenges that reality. Yeah. So you have to be able to articulate that reality in paint. You have to have the means to do that in order to then create that kind of the actual reality of that kind of questioning that goes on. But yeah, I mean, I think and I'm interested in the way people's imaginations change their reality, and I quite often say to people, if you could be sat next to somebody on a park bench looking out at the beautiful morning, and depending on the person next to you's state of mind or emotions or engagement, they can be in a completely different reality, looking at exactly the same thing.
Well, this is what I've often thought about in terms of when like curating a show like what we've done with the Mercer, which is all about this idea of mental connections. So it's quite a diverse offering, but it's about that moment where you see something and your mind is triggered to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that triggering will be completely different pathway for different people. So, for example, with these works behind me here, this blue, this sort of lapis lazuli blue reminds me so much of like Giotto and the Italian Renaissance, and so like the wealth of that. But for other people, it might simply be that intense night sky, or it might remind you of the sea, or it might remind you of something else that's blue, and then you're off in a completely different direction. I've been sent to Padua, but somebody else might have been sent to,
and I think that's all right. I mean, I think, as I was saying before, I think if there's an imaginative reality to the work that I make, then that will connect with the imaginative reality of other people. Yeah. So I think if there's a sincerity to what I'm trying to do, and I do that as truthfully as possible, that will connect.
Well, I'm very into this idea of like provocations, and I think artists who I'm drawn to and I'm excited to talk to are the ones who are trying to connect almost in any way possible with the viewer to trigger something. It could be anything. And whether, as we've talked about off camera, that idea of whether it's just about beauty, whether it's just about aesthetic appreciation, or whether it is about that like visceral connection with a moment in their day-to-day life or their sense of self.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think the function of art is to open a window onto the higher self or higher levels of consciousness. I mean, I think that, the very fact that art, poetry, and all the expressive arts can transport you to a different sort of sense of the world and yourself, a higher kind of reality, is a hugely optimistic thing, because it says there are other things, there are other hierarchies. Yeah. That are not this. Yes. There's something else. Yeah. And art,
there's possibility.
Although it's kind of earthbound because it's physical stuff, can say, actually, don't worry about anything, because there is this other thing that exists, these levels. And I think all great art raises human sensibilities to a height in which they can just perceive those things. We can never get to them, but we can perceive them. Yeah, and I think that's the function of art. I think anything else that doesn't attempt to do that is doing something which is different to what I do.
Yes.
Or attempt to do.
I really enjoy that idea that art is part of this journey to the next development, the next level, and it's kind of the mapping where we're kind of trying to get to.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be the same for everybody else. That's the other thing. It's all about the multiplicity. But it's at the same time giving people a chance to enter into a different realm.
Yeah.
Which is...
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the duty of the artist.
Yeah.
You know, I think if they're not doing that, then they're in visual culture in a different way from me.
Yeah.
You know, I think anything that doesn't attempt to restore soul and sanctity and a sense of wonderment and beauty, and as I say, these hierarchies of human experience, which have, you know, are catalogued since the beginning, then, you know, and I'm not saying I do that, but that's what I attempt to do.
Yeah. But
that's my orientation, is towards that goal.
But what I do also really like about your work, and we've spoken a little bit again before we started this interview about language and signification and signs and symbolism, and we were sort of talking about that idea of what happened before language, what happened with representation of art, creativity, culture, the soul, before we could write it down or before we could create shorthands for those moments. And what I do quite like about your work is there is this sort of sense that you're going back to that. You're using imagined motifs to create, to encapsulate some visceral connection that isn't necessarily legible in the ways that everybody else can read. That's what you've made.
Yeah.
And we all have to become these kind of translators.
Yeah.
And I think that that's quite a powerful process, you know, trying to interpret somebody else's lexicon.
Yeah.
And you might, some people might get it, and some people might have a different interpretation, but that's fine. It's about that action, that process of interpretation.
Yeah, yeah. It's the communication. I mean, I'm never. I don't have a strong. In fact, I have no particular sense of something I want people to get from the pictures.
Yeah.
I'm completely open for people to be confused, bemused, but I just have a kind of faith in that there's a sort of connection which goes on at an imaginative level. And as I said before, I just quite like people when people are talking to me and they just start, I can't really articulate this, and they just start tapping the chest somehow, and that seems to me to be the greatest sort of ovation that any piece of mind, you know, could possibly have.
Well, I mean, that's visceral. That's sort of the body. You know, they've had it's gone inside them.
Yeah,
almost.
and it's a kind of solar plexus. You know, which is like a, you know, it's that sort of. And I think that's the greatest compliment. And I just kind of trust that if I try to do that, then that will communicate itself on. Sometimes, you know, people get it straight away, and they can recognize it, and they understand that they share that feeling. You know, because you know, most of us do at some level, and then others, you know, kind of like the piece, and they'll say, "Oh, it reminds me of so and so," and then I'll perhaps bump into them a year later, and they'll say, "Do you know, I saw something, and there's something about that picture." I was speaking to somebody at the weekend who bought a picture a couple of years ago, and they said, there's something about it, and so there is a slow reveal somehow sometimes with it.
Well, I like that, again, that sense of that slow reveal, because your work kind of brings together so much of the past, like looking at like roads and paths that are sort of underneath the landscape that we can't see. There's the mythology, you know, this transmorphing of, you know, like bears into people, very like legendary mythological space. But yet here we are, we're talking about people can see worlds that they want to enter into, ideas that they want to enter into, and it's about going forward or some kind of developmental change. And I think that's again quite a, not necessarily confusing, but quite a wonderful encapsulation of past, present and future that is quite complicated.
Yeah.
To have something that's looking back, but at the same time moving forward.
Yeah, it's sort of personal and mythic. It's the idea of particularly with that map painting, of there being a sort of recognisable landscape in which the history of it is revealed with a kind of a graphic add-on map. So there's like two levels of consciousness in the way that the thing is revealed. You have this very gesturally painted landscape, and then the very, very conscious marks, which you get in Aboriginal art, of the kind of layered symbolism which you find in Aboriginal art for waterholes and for loads of silver or old mine shafts or bridges. So they did really draw on that very graphic depiction of the landscape, which you get in Aboriginal art, plus our own tradition of landscape painting, and kind of synthesize the two together. And for that, I had to simplify the landscape and the marks, in a sense. So the landscape becomes much flatter than perhaps it would be, and broader than it perhaps would be in other paintings. But there's that kind of synthesis. And interestingly, the Aboriginals have this idea of a kind of imbued energy, which is called rark. And you get it particularly in certain kinds of painting on bark, which is a very, very careful cross-hatching. And when it's done by a great master, the painting shimmers with a kind of energy, which they call dirimu. And it's sort of Newtonian in the sense that energy in equals energy out. And something of that carefulness, the hours and the energy, translates itself in the way that you physically kind of perceive this. And I was kind of in that map painting, the way that each of those lines is not a solid line, it's ticked in with individual brushstrokes, gives a sense of sort of some kind of movement around the map, which is not dirimu, but it's sort of inspired by the idea of it and the idea of the artist embodying their energy in the paint.
Yeah, but you've got a lot of elements of energy, and I like what you were saying again about that idea of like different layers, because you've got the almost like the conscious and the unconscious.
Yeah,
and I don't know if you want to say a little bit about like your unconscious process, like when you decide a painting is finished, or how you start to even like make that first incision onto the canvas with paint.
Yeah, well, I mean, I work in series, so I kind of know where the picture's going to start. The starting point for one picture is the picture that's just been finished. And so I might have a sense, like with these sunsets, that I'm going to work with this kind of sunset to night sky, and that the foreground's going to be dark, but there's going to be kind of odd things to be revealed in that sort of darkness. So I have a kind of a starting point which is fairly conscious, but then once you start to work with the paint, the process becomes less and less kind of conscious, because you become kind of engrossed in the paint so much sometimes that painting is kind of like breathing in a way. It's an unconscious sort of process, at the end of which a picture suddenly almost reveals itself to me, and it has, and I know that moment because it suddenly has its own life.
Yeah,
it doesn't need anything else, and at that moment it's step away from the canvas, put your brushes down and move away. It's that kind of a kind of thing, and
it's such a balancing act.
Yeah, and that sort of vigilance, which is something I used to talk to art students and people about, that vigilance to recognise that is something which I'm much better at now than I was when I was younger, and I'm much happy to leave a picture looking almost unfinished if I get the sense that life is there, and it's somehow held in the painting. There's a marvellous quote from Alfred Eastlake, who was head of the RA and around about the turn of the century. And I think he was talking about Sargent, and he said he was a wet into wet kind of. And he said of Sargent, he has the judicious unfinish of the consummate craftsman, which I always think is a great way of saying, he just could step away and let the paint be. He didn't need to fold it, or as soon as the paint was saying what it needed to say about the thing, the subject, then that was all.
Well, I do like some of those parts of Sargent's portraits in particular, where the edges seem to sort of fade
just
away.
Slices of paint, in the silky dresses, just it's amazing technical painting, amazing.
Yeah, it is just wonderful to see those sort of a bit like what we've been talking about today with reality. It sort of almost falls away from people.
Yeah. And the thing about painting and mark making is that, for instance, that the matte painting, you've got different sorts of consciousness embodied in the picture, because if you want to make a sort of gestural mark, a proper chance gestural mark, which has its own kind of currency in paint, it's really you have to be in a state of no mind.
Yeah,
it has to be made with no mind, Whereas if you're making one of those sort of traceries through the landscape, which you're hatching very, very consciously, that's an almost super conscious painting. So embodied in the painting have these different layers of consciousness, sort of symbolized by the way you're applying the paint.
Yeah, I think that is fascinating, because you've got that you're getting in touch with all of the levels of consciousness. Your active consciousness of, I need to do this picture, and then you're thinking about, well, what is my unconscious mark making process? What is my conscious mark making process? And even if you are so focused on making it look perfect, you're almost missing out on what it actually is. And particularly if you think about landscapes, that's always in flux.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the light's changing all the time, and things come into focus. Yeah. But it's interesting. That's the same with the painting, because you see a certain, painting in a certain light at twilight, or you have the electric lights on, and the whole reality of the painting changes as a story, as a narrative, as a arrangement of color and composition.
Yeah. Well, there's one. So I specialised in East Asian history of art, and we used to go to the Sir Percival David collection in the British Museum, which is this incredible collection of imperial ceramics. And there's this one vessel that is meant to be Percival David's favourite vessel. And apparently it's because in the light, the glaze is so thin and the ceramic is so thin that it changes colour in the light. But because it's in a case and in the museum, it has no opportunity to change colour. And so it kind of is now lost in this case. Which is such a kind of shame. And so the reality of an object, it is important that you're looking at it in flux.
Nothing's fixed.
And almost if it is fixed, it then becomes ironically unreal.
Exactly so. Which is the great mystery of great art objects. They're kind of impenetrable in a way, and this takes you back to my idea of having spontaneous and gestural things in there, because they are impenetrable of themselves. They somehow appear of their own volition and impose themselves on the painting, and then suddenly the painting has its own life, and you have to have the imaginative space and be brave enough to let that happen. And I think as I've got older, that's become I wouldn't say easier, but I'm able to facilitate that with open arms, and with a kind of shrug of the shoulders, more than I ever could when I was a younger artist, when I was more kind of uptight.
And do you have any sense of where you're moving towards now, or do you not try and force that?
No, I think that's a dangerous thing. I think to know where because you have to be prepared to react to the promptings of the imagination within a kind of nanosecond.
Yeah.
So even if I might consciously set off to do certain things, I'm sort of happy with the idea that I might end up in some completely other place, which then sets me off on a different set of ideas. But I'll know those set of ideas were meant to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even when everything goes wrong for a month and it's absolutely heartbreaking, you know that out of that, sometimes it's out of that desperation that the new thing arrives.
Well, it's so funny speaking to artists who talk about those moments of despair when artwork just isn't coming.
Yeah.
Because ultimately the things that we get to see as curators or as audience members or viewers or whatever it may be, you miss out on those moments of despair, and you just see these people come up with these creative work. So it's interesting. I always love hearing about those moments.
Yeah, I mean, it's so. I mean, you can never afford to, be too complacent about it, because the whole business of making art is mercurial and magic, and the Greeks, they did understand quite a lot, with the god Mercury. It can either bring the most wonderful gifts or absolutely terrorize you.
Yeah.
And painting is like that, and I want it to be like that, because the terrors are the truth of the things that really work.
Well, I suppose there's also that danger to it.
Yeah, there is. Yeah. And I
keeping you on your toes,
making
you work.
I hesitate to say that I get more dangerous as I get older, because that might not sound. But I think.
No, I think that's good. I think it's good to be like, I'm ready to take these risks. I'm ready to be more assertive, aggressive, dangerous.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, I know I can say the things I need to say, so I know that I can abandon them.
Yes, yeah. I think that's very cool.
And there is also a kind of absurdity to it all. To spend a life making images with strange shapes, with pigments. I still wake up and think, God, have you got away with this for 35 years?
Well, it is funny because looking at these images now, there is so much beauty in them. But there's an unreality. These colours are almost impossible in the sky. You might see them for a second.
That's right, yeah.
But it's almost an unnatural space. And so I quite like that absurdity. I like that you've used that word and self-described that.
That's right. I mean, a painting can never be a sunset. It can only ever be a painting.
Yeah.
So these are a sign for the intensity of feeling.
Yeah.
Which you get when you see a sunset.
Well, I think that the works that we've got in the show, as I said at the start of this interview, they are like 15 years old now, but they are still standing this test of time.
Yeah.
And they've still got this energy that you've been talking about. And I think when you look at these works, you can see that confidence that's grown, that assessment of what your work
the development,
is meant to be.
Yeah. But I think they were, truthful paintings of the artist at that time. I think they have a kind of swagger, which you can only have when you're kind of 30 and your career's going all right, and you think you can paint the world, And I kind of admire that swagger of that younger man, but I'm not that anymore.
Yeah.
So they're interesting, but like we were saying before, it's interesting seeing one of those pictures and seeing those physical marks that are mine of that younger man held there.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
So for you, a time machine, but for people just encountering them for the first time, an opportunity.
Yeah, and to understand the kind of the fluidity of energy in the landscape, glaciers forming them, that kind of the the sort of potency of landscape. When I think of those, Sienese paintings, the early ones, where there's every leaf on the tree is sort of painted, and it has a kind of energy which is the kind of embodiment of their, God, really. It's held there. A lot of them were painted by monks, and there's that kind of energy there. And I think that yes, there's been a development on from those, but I think those paintings were sincere.
Yeah.
And hopefully that sincerity is still translates itself. Even though I can see the improvements or the changes of technique.
Well, I think that's a very important place to have landed. I can see where I've come from, and you're happy with that development. But I definitely feel a sincerity in those works. I mean, when I was selecting them and placing them in the exhibition, they were works that really brought something into the show that I hadn't necessarily expected, and actually allowed me to explore other avenues of landscape painting with other artists. And so I think that there was a really amazing dialogue that could be created in that space, but it was grounded by the truth that all of the artists with their different perspectives could convey.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, you did a good job.
Well, you did a good job first. You did them, in the 2000s, and it stood the test of time. I mean, this exhibition's only been open a couple of weeks.
Yeah, but like I say, it's down to vigilance, and it's the vigilance of the artist and the vigilance of the person who wants to engage, with the world or with a painting or whatever. There is a, and vigilance is both an active and a passive state.
Yes. Yeah.
So, bravo, Joe. Vigilance.
Well, bravo, Chris. You've done it for all of these years, and you're still creating all of these amazing works. Thank you so much for joining me or having me in your studio. It's been so nice to come and see where the inspiration goes from mind to canvas, mind to paper. And yes, so if you want to come to the Mercer Gallery and have a look at Total Recall, Myth and Memory, you can see 3 of Chris's works, but Chris is also represented by the Goldmark Gallery, and you've got some projects coming up with them. Yeah,
I've got a pop-up show there on the 9th of September, Saturday the 9th of September, and I'll be doing a talk there at the same time. Is it?
Yeah.
Oh.
Great things happen on the 9th.
Let's hope so. But yeah, if anybody's interested in that, then if they just contact the Goldmark Gallery, and they can come along, and we'll book them in for a talk and an exhibition of recent and older paintings. So everyone's welcome.
Well, that sounds fantastic, and I can't recommend going exploring Chris's work enough. I think there are so many ideas in it. They're just wonderful to look at, and as we've talked about repeatedly on this podcast, is this idea of returning to the image and seeing new things. They keep on growing. They have that energy, that almost universal expansion energy that is just phenomenal. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
And thank you for joining us and exploring the creative process behind the works. I've been Joe Nickols, the curator of Total Recall, and I will see you for another instalment next time.